Hello there, welcome to Get Good. I'm Bruce, and this week we're doing a tutorial on TMM, True Metallic Metals. When I first started painting, metallic paints were what I used for metals because it seemed obvious. If you're painting a sword or a bolter, why wouldn't you want a bit of steel to slap on there and have it just look good immediately? It was only as I progressed further through my painting journey under the tutorship of people like Maunus and others that I began to pick up more NMM, non-metallic metals, and that's a technique that I've stuck with ever since. But when I attended MPO this year, seeing a whole host of models that were beautifully painted in TMM, that I realised it isn't that one is better than the other, but rather they're both tools and you can use them both to incredible effect. And so now that I've learned a few more things in my painting, I wanted to come back to TMM, try and apply some of those and see what kind of result I can get. Now, this video is going to cover about 30 minutes of real-time painting. I'm going to shorten it a bit, but I'll let you know when I do, because it's quite important to me that you learn as I learn, and hopefully some of the things that I pick up on and say are things that you can apply. So whether you're an army painter or someone that's interested in doing a bit more about TMM, hopefully this video is going to be useful. But for now, let's dive in. So I wanted to start how I typically would for any painting, which is to start at my darkest value, my lowest value, and then work my way up. And so what I did is I took AK Interactive's Natural Steel, which is a reasonably bright metal, and added some of this tenebrous grey, not sure how it's pronounced, but it gives this kind of rich deep purple with the metallics that I really liked. And this I knew would be essentially my base coat for the miniature, something that I could build upon going forward. I had this idea of this sword being held aloft and the light just catching in the very top, and that's what I'll pick out as I continue the paint job. But for now, just about getting that base colour down. So I'm just skipping ahead here so you don't have to literally watch the first layer dry on video, as I think that'd be a little bit boring, but I'm just here to ensure that the base coat is fully opaque and where I want it. One of the things that I will say in this video is I didn't use the wet palette for the metallics when I was painting, and because of how hot it gets in the studio, it really affects the working time and made it a little bit more tricky, a little bit more difficult. I think doing a subsequent TMM video, I definitely go back and look at this and probably use the wet palette just to give me a longer working time and make sure I don't have to stress about the paint drying out on me. So with the base coat down, I knew I wanted to go darker. So I get out the tenebrous grey. I actually used Google to tell me how to pronounce this in the interim. Tenebrous grey, and this is thinned quite a lot with water. I would say probably 1 part paint to 4 parts water. You can see here it's really translucent as I'm applying it, but I'm just really emphasizing the points that I want to be dark on the blade, because obviously that'll create a nice point of contrast as we build up with brighter metallics. So I'm using this thin down, and I'm essentially brushing it either into the tip of the sword or down into the base to ensure that those areas remain the darkest while dulling down the entire blade. But the objective here, like I say, is just to lower the value to make everything look a little bit dull. I'd say don't get afraid at this stage, because obviously we will be brightening it up as we go, and actually you do want a nice dark base to work from, certainly if you're someone like me that likes to work from dark to light. So I've skipped ahead here just to show what a few layers of that tenebrous grey looks like once it's dried. You can see it's really dulled down that natural steel that we started with, and this is the base that I want to work from now. So what I'm going to do is adding a new mix, which is that natural steel mixed with a bit of intensity blue. That's quite a hard word to say, so thank you Scale 75. But here I'm just roughing out the area where I want this bright spot to be. And because we're working with this natural steel and the blue, it's really easy to see kind of the rough shape of that highlight and what we're going to build from going forward. I'm sticking with the same principles I would for NMM here, where I'm keeping one side of the blade largely dark, although I will put a small bounce light into it, but I'm actually devoting most of my effort to the highlight. You'll see I've set the model down here. That's because I realised at this point that the metallic paints in the pot had dried, so I needed to whip up another batch quite quickly, which is always good fun. But it's about essentially now getting in those areas that I want the highlights to be. I think one of the challenges in painting TMM, which I didn't realise before I dived into this video, is actually seeing where you have applied your paint is very tricky and depends a lot on how the light from your painting light is hitting the model, and so you need to check it from many different angles just to see that paint application. And you can see on the very dark side of the blade I've actually been a bit sloppy and got some paint that's spilled over, so that's obviously a bit that I'll need to clear up. But it is kind of a key learning for me for this, is when you are applying these metallic paints, make sure you're checking from multiple angles just to see exactly where you've applied it, because that's also going to make blending these more difficult. So I've skipped ahead again to where that layer is dry, and I want to show this. I'm just tidying up the edges. I think sometimes when I watch YouTube tutorials, I always get this impression that everyone does it right first time, and that's just not true. So I've put down that slightly brighter layer, but I wasn't happy with how those edges were blending, so I'm going back with my base coat, which is this natural steel and tenebrous grey mix, and I'm just blending those in a bit better to make sure that everything is neat, because I really don't want any harsh lines in the metallics. You can see here that I'm essentially rotating the sword slightly just to see how it looks in different lighting, to actually check my blends. So that this is going to be a bit of a back and forth process when you're working with TMM. Make sure you're happy with the blends before moving on to the higher layers, and that's all part of the fun really for me. And this part of the reason I enjoy painting is just to go back and forth and make sure everything's how I like it before moving on. Trust the process essentially. So those first two layers are down, and I'm going my layer up, which is just natural steel with nothing added. The ink intensity, goodness, I'm going to enjoy saying that, blue, is it does dull down that steel colour slightly, so you can just add natural steel back in to raise the brightness. And again, you can see here I'm having to check multiple angles to check the blends to see where the paint is actually applied. It is probably the thing I find most challenging about painting in true metallics. I also realised at this point that I wanted to put in an edge highlight just to see how that would affect the look of the blade. If I'm painting typical volumes, like you would have seen in the Space Marine shoulder pad video, if you've watched that, I like to edge highlight at the end because I want to trust the blends that I've put in place. But with metallics, whether that's NMM or TMM, I like to edge highlight reasonably early on in the process, so that if there's anything wrong, I can diagnose it early on and then move on. So I'm just roughing in an edge highlight. I can and will hone this later as I go, but at this stage it's just about getting that edge highlight down, that wicked sharp side of the blade. This is also peeking behind the curtain of YouTube production. One of the things I hate most about painting on camera, I'm usually very close to the model when I'm edge highlighting, and doing it with my arms further away with a very shiny surface is incredibly tricky. So all you TMM edge highlighters out there, I feel your pain. So the edge highlighting is in, and I've had a little cry because it's unneat and that made me sad, but it was good enough for me to look at the whole picture. And I realised I wanted to darken the contrast down, so I'm going back to that tenebrous grey mix and I'm just pushing the contrast, making sure the dark areas are darker so that the light areas can pop a little bit more. I've also swapped brushes now. I was using a size 1, I've now moved to a 00 just because that's my preferred size for any sort of detailing work when I essentially can't be sloppy. Again, I'm moving the model around always to check those blends. It's probably the thing I've learned most about this, is always look at different angles to ensure that your blends are okay. So for the very brightest value, I'm now putting in some Vallejo Model Air Chrome. It's a beautifully shiny chrome, a really nice metal to base a lot of things over, and it's just to make the very final highlight pop as much as possible. I'll also use this then to edge highlight the rest of the sword. And so here I am with that. I'm just applying a thicker edge highlight around the blade. I actually went back to the larger brush here because I realised it was a lot easier to get the thickness of the edge highlight that I wanted. So that's all I'm doing. I'm now using the Vallejo Model Air Colour long word of paint to apply a nice thick edge highlight around the sword, just to make that idea of a wicked edge stand out a lot more. And with the edge highlight done, we're done, which is always nice. I actually flip the sword around here so you can see the flat side, basically what you'd get if you just painted the single layer of metallic paint. I wanted to include that for reference, and it still looks fine, but it lacks a bit of visual interest, and I do like this slightly more layered approach and being able to point to that singular hard highlight. I just think it brings a lot more interest to the sword. When I was reviewing the footage for this, I realised that actually most of my time was spent fretting about blends or waiting for layers to dry, and so actually 30 minutes of painting was probably closer to 10 minutes. So hopefully this shows what you can achieve in quite a short amount of time if you're just moving between the layers, making sure your blends are good and pushing towards an end result. With more time on this, what I would do is bring the blends in, essentially make them better. There's a little bit of untidiness still with the edge highlight. I think that's something I need to work on, is edge highlighting with TMMs. But overall, for a short amount of time, I'm really pleased with the end result. That's all for now though. If you've liked this video, consider giving us a subscribe or getting in touch and telling us what kind of content you'd like to see in future. But for now, goodbye.